Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. David Bradshaw. He is one of the coordinators of this conference. He is professor of philosophy at the University of Kentucky, and the title of his talk is Orthodoxy and the Beauty of Chastity. So please welcome David.
Thank you, David.
Okay.
Well, there's a lot going on in the world today that's very grim, but we should never lose sight of the beauty of chastity, and especially as it's presented to us through the saints, through the richness of our worship, through the Theotokos. And so that's what I'll be turning to today. I really got into this question partly because I was thinking about, well, what's the difference between chastity and a term you hear a lot in secular contexts, abstinence? Obviously, one is positive, one is negative. But I think there's a lot we can find just by pondering that contrast. And that's what led me to the subject of beauty. The beauty of chastity is one of the great themes of Western literature. The Arthurian romances turn on the contrast between the adulterous love of Lancelot and Guinevere and the chastity and fidelity of Sir Galahad. They present in vivid form the contrast between the ugliness of a passion that destroys a whole kingdom and the nobility that enables Sir Galahad to attain the Holy Grail. In another great medieval work, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, it is Sir Gawain's chaste refusal of temptation that saves him from the uncanny threat posed by the Green Knight. Perhaps the finest flower of chivalric literature is Edmund Spenser's Faerie Queen, a vast tapestry of symbolically charged chivalrous adventure. For Spenser, the virtue of chastity figures centrally not only for its own sake, but as an emblem of fidelity to God. About the same time, Shakespeare was translating the chivalric ethos into gritty and profoundly moving human dramas. His plays abound in characters whose chastity and integrity elicit our admiration, even as it places them in danger, sometimes, as in Othello, with tragic results. That chastity is a central virtue was an unquestioned assumption of Western civilization for almost 2,000 years. Nonetheless, as society began to move away from its Christian moorings, a new sexual ethic inevitably followed. Already in the 17th century, freethinkers, deists, and the so-called rakes of the court of Charles II began to advance the idea that all morality is merely a human invention. Often this belief was accompanied by a rosy optimism about what life would be like if only Christian inhibitions could be left behind. So I'm simply pointing out this is really nothing new. It's been part of the modern world for as long as it's been modern. Today, of course, it's hard to be so optimistic. 2 generations have gone by since the sexual revolution of the 60s put into practice what the rakes, romantics, and free thinkers had long advocated. We've passed from the initial heady sense of liberation of the 60s and 70s, through the consequent explosion of abortion, divorce, cohabitation, and single motherhood, to the hookup culture of the 90s, and finally to the so-called rape culture of today. I say so-called because it is far too facile to think that the current sense of mistrust and alienation between the sexes is due simply to male sexual violence. Nonetheless, the phrase does rightly highlight that many young men today have grown up watching pornography that glamorizes rape and other forms of sexual perversion. This is a subterranean influence that has done much to poison relations between the sexes. Coming on top of the chain of events the rest of the chain of events that followed the sexual revolution, the result has been what a recent writer for The Atlantic has called a sex recession, a state in which young adults are having less sex, not because it's hard to arrange, but because they do not find the very idea of it interesting or appealing. In light of this situation, what can Orthodoxy contribute? I will say, first of all, that I do not think Orthodoxy has any distinctive teaching about chastity or purity. Our teaching on this subject is drawn from the same biblical and classical sources as that of Western Christianity, and it is at home in the same imaginative world as that which nourished the great works of Western literature. Instead, I would suggest that what Orthodoxy offers is a way of life in which the real beauty of chastity is both more readily apparent and more accessible than it would be otherwise. What is important here is not just our sexual ethics, but the way that this ethics is embedded in practices of worship, repentance, forgiveness, and self-denial. It is these that make the ideal of chastity at once attractive and realistic. Apart from them, this ideal must, at least typically, appear as no more than an arbitrary imposition. My thinking on this subject was spurred by a comment I saw some time ago on a blog. I'll repeat it here not because I know it to be true, but because I found it thought-provoking. The comment was offered by a man who identified himself as a gay Catholic. He said that he thought the sudden upsurge in militant homosexuality in the late 60s would not have occurred had it not been for the collapse of Roman Catholic liturgy following Vatican II. He made the simple point that people need beauty, and when they cease to find it where it has traditionally been most evident in the church, they'll look elsewhere. The result, in his view, was that people, and young men in particular, began to seek beauty in the idealized male form, much as had the ancient Greeks. As I said, I cannot vouch for the truth of this theory. However, I believe the author was right on at least this point, that people need beauty. One has only to look at the world around us today, our architecture, our traffic, our music, our pop culture, our very clothes, to recognize that beauty is in short supply. That is not to say that it cannot be found if one knows where to look. But how is one to know, given that our educational system has no concern for beauty and acts as if it does not exist? For us as Orthodox, this should be of particular concern, because we believe that beauty is one of the names of God. Indeed, according to St. Dionysius the Areopagite, it is, along with the good, the first name of God, prior even to being. That's in his work, The Divine Names. We should therefore be particularly concerned that the world we live in is one that is starved of beauty. The absence of beauty deprives the soul of the opportunity to recognize and respond to the divine presence in creation, that presence by which, according to Dionysius, God is in all creatures, calling us to himself. What about the beauty of chastity in particular? Granted that this is not an explicit theme in most Orthodox theology and liturgy, it does figure prominently in at least one important text. This is the climactic hymn of the Acha'this to the Theotokos, sung on the first 5 Fridays of Lent in the Greek tradition and the 5th Friday in the Russian tradition. The Acha'this both begins and ends with Gabriel at the Annunciation, marveling at what God has done. Let us consider the ending hymn first, for it is the one most relevant to our topic. Gabriel exclaims, "Astounded by the comeliness of your virginity and the exceeding splendor of your purity, Gabriel cried out to you, O Theotokos, what hymn of praise is fitting for me to present to you? What name shall I give you? I am lost and stand in wonder. Wherefore, as I was commanded, I cry to you, Hail, O bride unwedded." The term translated comeliness here is horiatos, the beauty of one who is horios, in the bloom of life. The term translated purity is hagneia, a term that originally meant ritual purity. In the Old Testament, hagneia is used of the purity of one who has taken the vows of a Nazirite and of one who is authorized to enter the sanctuary, as well as that of the sanctuary itself. From ritual purity, it is a short step to moral purity, including chastity, so it is not surprising that hagneia soon acquired this further sense. St. Paul speaks of his desire to present the Corinthian church to Christ as a chaste hagne virgin, and he urges Timothy to be a model of purity, hagneia, and to address young women, quote, as sisters with all purity, again, hagneia. The Latin equivalent of hagneia is chastitas, the source of chastity in English. Thus, the ideal of moral purity is one root of our concept of chastity. However, it is not the only one. Another term that is often translated as chastity, particularly in patristic literature, is sophrosune. This is the virtue of temperance or self-control, one of the traditional 4 cardinal virtues. By the imperial era, its most common meaning had narrowed to sexual temperance or self-control, or in other words, chastity. Although hagneia and sophrosune often overlapped in Christian usage, they retain distinctive connotations. Hagneia indicates the purity of a way of life that is set apart from that of the world, particularly that of consecrated virgins, widows, and monastics, as well as that of the church itself. Sophrosune indicates the habit of sexual self-control that is expected of everyone, although the form it takes naturally varies depending on one's station and walk of life. I find this distinction helpful in thinking about the beauty of chastity. Sophrosune is beautiful in the way that any virtue is beautiful. It is one of the qualities that St. John Chrysostom advises a wise husband to praise in his bride, along with her propriety, gentleness, discretion, openness, and piety. Good though it is, it has no distinctive beauty that is not also possessed by these other traits. Hagneia is different. It possesses a very distinctive kind of beauty, one that had to be discovered, so to speak, in the course of Christian experience. Part of what is so noble and edifying about the Acha'thist service is that it leads us through this very process of discovery. I return now to the Acha'thist, because I think we find here the key to what is missing from the way chastity is viewed in society today. As I mentioned earlier, the service begins, following the small compline, with the Annunciation as seen through the eyes of Gabriel. Here we see Gabriel primarily in the role of a dutiful servant, obeying the commands of his master. He marvels at the Virgin, to be sure, but less because of any trait intrinsic to her than because of what his master has done. He proclaims, with mystic apprehension of the divine commandment, the bodiless angel quickly appeared in the house of Joseph and said to the unwedded virgin, Lo, he who in his descent bowed the heavens is housed unchanged and whole in thee. As I behold him in thy womb taking on the form of a servant, I marvel and cry unto thee, Hail, O bride unwedded. Beauty is not mentioned here. Nonetheless, what Gabriel describes is profoundly beautiful. Indeed, it is perhaps the highest form of beauty that can be apprehended by the human mind, the unlooked-for, undeserved, and deeply mysterious act of God becoming man, solely out of abundance of love. Gabriel can only obey in awestruck wonder the command he has been given, marveling all the while at the Virgin in whose womb the eternal God now makes his abode. Much like Gabriel, we learn much here. We learn in the first place the incredible, unfathomable extremity of divine love. We learn the exalted place that this love has given to an otherwise unknown Jewish maiden. And we learn something about the nature of beauty itself, that it consists not only in the manifestation of the divine nature, as philosophers had long believed, but more specifically in the manifestation of divine love. It is for this reason that God's act itself is a supreme form of beauty. Thus, among the many things that the divine incarnation revolutionizes, there is our understanding of beauty itself. The canon that follows this hymn amplifies profusely the marvel of the Virgin containing God. She is, quote, the mountain of spiritual riches, seasoned by the Spirit, the ladder elevating all from earth by grace, the fiery chariot of the Logos, the living paradise having the Lord, the tree of life, in her midst. But soon there is another element as well. At the start of the seventh ode, the focus shifts suddenly to the three holy youths in the fire. And this is the hymn. The godly-minded youths did not worship the creature instead of the Creator, but valiantly rejecting the threat of fire, they joyfully sang, Blessed art thou, most praised Lord, and God of our fathers. This sudden shift is not explained until the subsequent ode, where it is linked to the theophany at the burning bush. And here again is that hymn. Verily Moses comprehended in the bush the great mystery of thy birth-giving. The youths prefigured this most clearly, standing in the midst of the fire without being burned, O pure and holy Virgin. Wherefore we praise you unto all the ages. Much is said here, and even more is implied. The point is not only that the youths in the fire, like the burning bush, prefigured the Theotokos, who contained God in her womb but was not consumed. We must bear in mind as well that the youths were kept safe in the fire only because of their single-minded refusal to surrender to temptation. The youths thus prefigure the Theotokos not only by the miracle of their remaining unburnt in the fire, but by their purity and their fitness to receive God. Of course, we too face temptation, and we too may someday find ourselves in the situation of the three youths. The hymn thus invites us to see ourselves as called in our own way to prefigure the Theotokos, or perhaps better, since we are subsequent to her in time, to partake of her purity. There is thus now a personal link between us and her. We have moved from marveling at the divine act and the exalted place it has given her to turning to her as our model and guide. The following hymns make this clear. Above all, the magnificent Kontakion addressed to the Theotokos by the imperial city of Constantinople to thee, our champion. Yet there is still one more step through which the Acha'thist must lead us. At the end of the service, following the Acha'thist proper and the second singing of the Kontakion, but before the final hymn of Gabriel, there are 5 prayers that are addressed alternately to the Theotokos and to Christ. In Greek practice, these are typically read respectively by a laywoman before the icon of the Theotokos and a layman before the icon of Christ. But in any case, even when they're read by the priest, they present a striking contrast to the sense of wonder and exuberance in the earlier hymns. Here is the beginning of the first prayer. O spotless, undefiled, incorruptible, pure, and chaste, Hagne, Virgin Bride of God, who by your wondrous conception united God the Logos with man, and joined our fallen nature with the heavens, the only hope of the hopeless, and the help of the persecuted, the ever ready to rescue all that flee to you, and the refuge of all Christians. Spurn me not, the branded sinner, who by shameful thoughts, words, and deeds have made my whole being useless, and through indolence have enslaved my judgment to the pleasures of this life. But as the mother of the merciful God, mercifully show compassion to me, the sinner and prodigal, and accept my supplication which is offered unto you from impure lips. Here we no longer imagine ourselves in the place of Gabriel, nor even in that of the imperial city. Instead, each of us stands before the Theotokos as a suppliant, seeking the aid that we desperately need. And we do so now not with the joy and wonder of the previous hymns, but out of deep contrition, recognizing the contrast between her purity and our own shameful and defiled life. This is the final step in which we learn to recognize the real beauty of the Theotokos, and through her that of chastity itself. We no longer appreciate this beauty as something from which we stand apart in disinterested admiration. It is worthy of admiration, to be sure, but we now recognize in it that which we desperately need, and we recognize also in the Theotokos our only help. Not, of course, that there's not help in Christ, to whom we also pray, and in God, whose boundless love worked the incarnation. But she is the loving mother who especially hears us in our need. The final hymn brings all of these strands together, as Gabriel now marvels at both the wonder of the incarnation and the beauty of the Theotokos, still finding no words that are sufficient to praise her. I hope it'll be clear now why I say that Orthodoxy does not have so much a distinctive teaching about chastity as a distinctive way of life in which chastity is appreciated and pursued. That way of life is one of prayer, worship, and reverence for the saints, including especially the Theotokos. It is also one of repentance and confession, along with fasting and other ascetic disciplines. Within this way of life, the beauty of chastity shines forth at almost every turn. But apart from it, chastity becomes merely sophrosune, self-control, as it was for the ancient pagans. The element of otherworldly beauty is lost, and with it the power of chastity to withstand the expectations of society around us. We Orthodox then have our work cut out for us, to speak from within this ancient and holy way of life to a modern world that is in desperate need and has lost any sense of the beauty of chastity. Even so, this beauty is just as real for us today as it ever was, and the more we recover it in our own lives, the more we'll be able to share it with others. Thank you.